Hello everyone, welcome back to Too Sweet MTG and welcome to another Commander deck tech. In today's video, we're going to be looking at Nekusar the Mindrazer. It is 2 blue, black and a red for a 2/4 legendary creature zombie wizard. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, and whenever an opponent draws a card, Nekusar the Mindrazer deals 1 damage to that player. Nekusar has been wheeling and dealing damage to playgroups ever since its first printing in 2013, and after a decade of forced card draw, its recent reprint in Commander Masters seems like the perfect time for us to talk about this icon of a commander. So, how do you build a Nekusar commander deck? Well, being completely honest, the game plan is written on the card. Firstly, we're going to want to force our opponents to draw extra cards in line with Nekusar's top ability. A lot of this will be done with what's known as wheel effects. These are spells or effects that make players discard their hand and draw a bunch more cards. These are generally the most bang for your buck as they'll draw you the most amount of cards the quickest, but we will also be running some less impactful but more consistent bits of forced card draw as well. We'll then combine that with cards that mimic the bottom ability of Nekusar, that specifically deal damage to our opponents whenever they draw a card. This is a pretty powerful combination and can be very scary when it gets going. With Nekusar or a similar effect out, 1 wheel can deal 7 damage to every opponent. You might be thinking that giving all our opponents extra card draw is not a good thing, but when it's dealing them that much damage, as well as messing up their game plan by making them constantly discarding or shuffling away their hands, it becomes super hard for them to deal with. And what's even better is that one of the strongest things about this strategy, that there's so much redundancy in these effects that you can win the game without ever casting the commander. Before we jump in, a quick note on how this video will work. What we'll be doing is giving you a breakdown of all the different types of sections that you need to make the deck work. We won't be giving you a full deck list, rather we'll be giving you all the categories and the number of cards in each category that you need to run. You can then pick the ones that suit your budget or your playstyle. All the sections and any cards we mentioned will be down in the description below. So, let's start off with the forced card draw section. This will be fairly chunky as this is really the part that allows us to repeatedly deal damage to our opponents and also leads to the most explosive late game turns. First up is some repeatable wheel effects, with cards like Jace's Archivist, Teferi's Puzzle Box and Dragon Mage. These all make our opponents discard their hand and draw a bunch of cards turn after turn, which when combined with Nekusar and some of our other effects will add up to an absolute ton of damage. After that, you have your one-time wheel effects, one-shots of draw and damage, with cards like Wheel of Fate, Winds of Change, Dark Deal, Magus of the Wheel, Molten Psyche, Windfall, Wheel and Deal, Whispering Madness, Reforge the Soul and Echo of Eons to name but a few. The best ones on this list are cheaper to cast and draw you at least 7 cards, but those tend to be the pricier options. What's great though is that there is an absolute ton of these effects to choose from, so you really can find ones to suit your budget, which we absolutely love. After those, you have your less impactful but more consistent ways of making everyone draw extra cards. You have things like Howling Mine, Kami of the Crescent Moon, Master of the Feast, Temple Bell, Font of Mythos and Seizan Perverter of Truth. Yes, they're not as flashy as the wheel effects, but if you can land one of these early in the game, they'll just add up to so much additional card draw, which we will be converting into damage. They will honestly be fantastic. Talking of damage, let's talk about our damage dealers. These are effects that will run alongside Nekusar to pile pressure onto the life totals whenever our opponents start drawing cards. However, because we do have Nekusar in the command zone, we won't need as many of these as the forced card draw. Starting off, we have a bunch of options that just deal damage whenever an opponent draws a card. While creatures like Kederekt Parasite, Orcish Bowmasters, and Sheoldred the Apocalypse are pretty expensive, cards like Underworld Dreams, Fate Unraveler, and Spiteful Visions are way more reasonably priced and much kinder on the wallet. These are all fantastic options that ping each opponent for each card that they draw. So if they draw 7 cards, they're taking at least 7 damage, which really brings down everyone's life totals super quickly, and they only get better if we have additional of these effects out and in play. Another fairly reasonably priced option is Spark Double, which can come down as a copy of Nekusar for twice the fun. Then another solid option is Psychosis Crawler. This deals damage to each opponent whenever we draw a card, which, as we'll be drawing cards when we cast a wheel effect as well, will just work fantastically. And while Liliana's Caress is a couple of quid, we can also look at cheaper options like Megrim and Fell Specter. These deal damage whenever an opponent discards a card, which will happen when we cast a wheel effect, another great budget option that can also be considered. And then lastly, we have Fevered Visions. This just does a little bit of everything, but it's a great card that can come down early and just cause a really annoying amount of damage over the course of a game. Next up is our card draw section. This might seem a little bit weird to run this on top of our forced card draw effects, but we all love drawing more cards, and this just helps smooth out the deck. First up, we have some cards that synergize with Nekusar. Firstly, we can put Curiosity on Nekusar, so whenever an opponent draws a card, Neki will deal them a damage, and Curiosity will trigger and then will draw a card. Remember, this will trigger off of each opponent as well, so this really will be an immense amount of card draw. We then have Faerie Mastermind, which with all the forced card draw will easily add up to us drawing at least 3 to 9 extra cards each turn cycle. Then we have Obnixious Captive Kingpin. As Nekusar deals exactly 1 damage whenever each opponent draws a card, not only will Obby get absolutely huge, but we'll get a bunch of extra cards into exile, which we can then cast and play until the end of our next turn. We then have Consecrated Sphinx. This massive creature draws us an ungodly amount of cards whenever an opponent draws any cards. It importantly is also a May, so you don't even have to worry about drawing too many cards that you have none left in your library. Then lastly, we are in blue, and we have some of the best cheap bits of card draw going, with spells like Ponder and Preordain that we can just play early to get everything started. Moving on to our ramp section, and like with most decks, we're going to want between 8 to 10 bits here. Because we're not in green, our options are primarily going to come from artifacts. Up first is Wayfarer's Bauble, a great artifact that can go and get a basic land from our deck and put it into play. Then we have our pretty standard selection of mana rocks. We have our Soul Ring, our Arcane Signet, and then a selection of talismans and other signets for us to choose from. The other rocks I would consider running here are Thought Vessel and Decanter of Endless Water, as they make it so we don't have a maximum hand size, which will just come in really handy with all the forced card draw that we're running, and will make cards like Windfall that wheel for the greatest hand size all the stronger. 2 more expensive options now, with Chromatic Lantern, which because I'm lazy, I run in any 3+ colour deck, and then Relic of Sauron, which taps for all of our colours and at a pinch can also help out with some more lovely card draw. Next up is our interaction section, and as we're in Grixis, this should not be difficult to get the minimum 8 bits that we need, and then you can go up from there the more competitive your playgroup is. First we have some great bits of targeted removal. It either needs to be cheap and efficient, like Pongify and Eternal Grasp, or it needs to hit as wide a range of threats as possible, like Bedevil and Chaos Warp. For some board wipes, we have a card like Archfiend of Ifnir. This is absolutely disgusting with all the wheel effects, where we're going to be constantly discarding our hand and just making our opponent's boards disappear. The fact this also gets around indestructible can be absolutely huge in games. Then in these colours, we have some great board wipes. Toxic Deluge and Damnation are just the gold standard, and then Blasphemous Act is a fantastic budget option that any deck with red should just consider. There are plenty of other budget options out there as well, so run what works best for you. Next up is a little bit of protection. I'll be honest, opponents hate Nekusar, so it will have a massive target on its back for most of the game. First, we have cards that work with Nekusar. You have Arcane Denial, which counters a spell and then makes people draw more cards. Then we have Commit to Memory. This nerfs a spell and then importantly is a draw 7 when in the graveyard. We then have an Offer You Can't Refuse and Negate. These just stop things dead when we need an answer, such as our opponent's targeted removal and board wipes. We then have the always great Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, another fantastic way of protecting Nekusar from any targeted hate. Okay, so we have the base of our deck, let's go over some dedicated ways of us winning the game. First up, we have some ways of boosting up that damage that Nekusar dishes out. Harmonic Prodigy, Gerson's Starn Kellamorph, and Solfim Mayhem Dominus all basically increase the damage output that Nekusar dishes out whenever an opponent draws a card, meaning we can kill our opponents all the quicker. The other way we can buff up that damage is with cards like Sigil of Sleep, which can repeatedly reset an opponent's board, or Phyresis, which gives Nekusar Infect, meaning it only needs to deal 10 damage to each opponent to take them out of the game. We can also ramp up our opponent's card draw to obscene levels with Forced Fruition and Peer into the Abyss. Forced Fruition makes our opponents draw 7 cards whenever they play a spell, which with Nekusar means they'll just take so much additional damage. You then have Peer into the Abyss, which just honestly takes the player straight out of the game. It is super scary. Then next we have the Locust God. With all the wheels and additional card draw, this will make a super scary board state of Hasty Locust unbelievably quickly. We then have Teferi Temporal Pilgrim, which again with all those wheel effects will put so many loyalty counters onto Tefers, we could ultimate it the turn it comes into play. When we do, that will just send a player completely back to the Stone Age. When we're discarding cards to all those wheels, we have cards like Waste Not and Bone Miser that are obscene bits of card advantage, giving us zombie tokens, mana, and more card draw. Another way of weaponizing that discard is with Tergrid, God of Fright, which whenever an opponent discards a permanent, we just get it, meaning we can beat our opponents with their own decks. With all this card draw and discard, there are 2 ways that you can take it. You can either run cards like Ixer of Immortality and Kozilek Butcher of Truth, which will shuffle your graveyard into your library, meaning you won't ever mill out, meaning you can just keep drawing cards and wheeling and then dealing damage with Nekusar to win. Or you can run cards that reward you for all that drawing and discarding, with cards like Thassa's Oracle and Laboratory Maniac. These win you the game when you have no cards left in your library, which with all the card draw is actually quite doable. If you're considering running these two cards, make sure not to run any of the draw 7s that shuffle your graveyard and hand into your library, as you really want to get to the bottom of the deck as quickly as possible. Rounding off the deck with some utility lands, as we're a 3-colour deck, we can't run as many as we want as much fixing as possible. For some colourless lands, we do have to mention Reliquary Tower. Letting us keep all those gains will just be really helpful. We then have Gaia Reach Sanitarium and Mikakoro, Center of the Sea. Great cards for just some additional damage and card draw. Then we have Bojuka Bog. At some point, we'll make a player discard something that we really don't want in the graveyard. This just helps take care of that nice and neatly. Right, thank you all very much for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. We're currently racing towards 100,000 subscribers. We've only got about 96 or so thousand to go, something like that. But if you could, it would really help me out. But anyway, until next time, I will see you all soon. Goodbye.